grade here at Gesu. I want to welcome all of you this afternoon to our annual symposium. I have attended Gesu since pre-K. The things I most enjoy at Gesu are the advanced classes. I love the challenges of advanced writing and advanced math. I enjoy working with the staff here every day. They make learning exciting. When I graduate, I would like to attend Marian Mercy Academy or Springside Chestnut Hill Academy. When I grow up, I would like to be a pharmaceutical scientist. Now, I would like to introduce our president, Brian Carter.
Thank you, Mr. Ratcliffe and the choir, and thank you, Damani. And welcome and thank you to all of you for making time to join us for our 18th annual symposium on transforming inner city education. As we thought about a topic for this year's symposium, tragic events such as the church massacre in Charleston seem to occur on an almost daily basis. In addition, we saw and heard news of events of great significance, such as the visit of Pope Francis to Philadelphia. As educators and parents, we all are well aware and fully capable of explaining to our children the importance of the papal visit. But when our children return to school, after seeing and learning about, for example, the church massacre in Charleston, how do we encounter them at school? How do we initiate discussions with them about this particular topic? And should we? At Gesu School, we noticed that our children were not talking about these topics at all. However, annually we publish a literary magazine which includes the works of our children, and what we found was they're writing about it. Thus, the genesis of this topic for our symposium. We're fortunate to have an exceptional group of speakers who will lead us on this particular learning journey, and I'd like to introduce them to you now. Dr. Mary McNaughton Castle is professor of psychology at the University of Texas, San Antonio, and a leading researcher as it relates to the psychological impact of media events. Michael Spikes, and I must say he's from my hometown of Cleveland, and not sway me from asking him to come and join us. But Michael is the director of the Digital Resource Center and the Center for News Literacy at Stony Brook University in Stony Brook, New York. And Michael's work really focuses on news media, news literacy, and evaluating the news that we see each and every day. And then Dana Weeks is the head of school at Germantown Friends School, where they have in place specific protocols and strategies for how they will interact and encounter the children when events such as the church massacre in Charleston occur. And Dana will share with us some of those protocols and strategies that they have in place at Germantown Friends. And last but not least, Tanya English, senior writer for WHYY and the weekly radio show, The Pulse, will lead us as our moderator for today's symposium. So welcome to the panelists, and thank you so much for joining us. So what you'll see next is a brief video, after which Dr. McNaughton Castle will join us for a discussion. Thank you again.
African-American teenager was shot and killed by police in the St. Louis suburb of Ferguson, Missouri.
All around destruction.
The struggle spilled out onto the street where Brown, who investigators said was not
Arguably, there's still no trace of Malay economies and societies.
And you can tell that even though I study the media, I am not the queen of understanding technology. So hopefully I will be able to get through this. But I want to start with a phrase called mind the gap, which I will come back to at the end. The basic idea behind this is that this is a warning they give you when you are on the tube in London, and it is to tell you not to let your foot drop into the gap between the platform and the train. And I've taken to using this as a metaphor for stress, because I define stress as the gap between what we have and what we want. And I will be arguing that the way to manage stress is really how you think about it, which is where the mind piece comes in. Now, I started thinking about stress in the news media. I can tell you the exact date. It was the morning of the Oklahoma City bombing, because I had young kids, they were in daycare, and I'm sure some of you remember the coverage. And they were saying there was a nursery there and children were injured. And I got really upset driving in my car in Texas thinking, how would I feel if my kids were in that circumstance? And that's when it dawned on me that the way the news is conveyed to us and how we process it has changed a lot over the last couple of decades. You know, if you look back in history, getting access to news was the hard part. Many people didn't read, took a long time for news to travel. Sometimes messages got lost. There are stories of battles that happened after the war was supposed to be over because the notice didn't even get there. So the news media in the days before technology really had to focus on finding out and getting us information. Of course, now we are in the different boat where we're overwhelmed by information. And that was what the video just showed us, that there is a constant onslaught of information from lots of different sources with lots of different points of view, and much of it is negative and disturbing for us and of course also for children. Now, of course, a few of us remember the days when there was one TV in the living room and the shows only came on at that time. I try to tell my college students that and they look at me like I'm a dinosaur, you know. Or you remember when the stations went off at night and they just had fuzz until 6 in the morning? And people said that Turner Broadcasting wouldn't work, that nobody would watch 24-hour news. Well, of course, now we have constant news feed, and it is not just our TVs or even our radios or the print, but also the internet, Facebook, social networking. A lot of college students, including my own daughters, don't have TV anymore because they don't pay for cable where they live. So you know how they find out information? And they will tell me this. I just wait to see if it's trending on Facebook. If it's big enough, I'll see it there. And that's a little bit of a different way of consuming news. And sometimes I talk about not just the media, but also technology, because I think this is all part of a very subtle change. We have just kept on adjusting to increases. So now we have TV 24 hours, now we have internet, now we have all of these other sources, and we haven't really stopped to think about how they're affecting our lives. And that's part of what we're talking about today, is thinking about that. Now, a lot of times, we rightly say that the news media has a tendency to exaggerate things, to grab our attention. You have to look at this for a minute before you figure out their error. And in part that is because they really do want to grab our attention, and they're competing with reality shows, talk shows, ads, and all the other things we have going on. But that leads to problems in terms of our understanding what is going on, because we hear a lot of things over and over again, often in sound bites or bits, often without a lot of information about the sources. And one of the sort of foibles of human memory is if we hear something often enough, we'll remember it and even start to believe it's true. And a lot of times we'll forget where we heard it. So the source might not be terribly credible, but we will be thinking that it was something we heard that we need to be concerned about. Now, we complain about this a lot, and of course we all do. People say, well, what's with the news media? You know, if it leads, it leads. And that is partly their efforts to combat changes in the technology of the news as well. The people will say to me, well, in the golden age of Walter Cronkite, you know, we had neutral news and they told you the facts. If you look back, and some folks in communication have done this, they were really subsidized programming. In those eras, television stations did not have to make money off the news, and they didn't have to compete with the 24-hour folks who could scoop them. So they had really a different kind of model of delivery going. In today's world, you probably know that some of the most violent news you'll see is the local media, right? Notice that on local TV? That's because they have the smallest budgets and the hardest time staying alive. They don't have a lot of funding from bigger sources. But it's not only that they're trying to stay alive, but it's also that we're wired to look at negative things. And people will be disparaging about this as well. You drive by a wreck and you look over. But there's a biological reason for that. And it is that our central nervous system is wired to be vigilant for threats. If something is threatening, you want to look at it. You want to see if it's something that could happen to you. If you're looking at the news and they say someone was robbed at an ATM, what are the first things you think of? Where's the ATM? Do I ever go there? What time of night was it? Oh, it was 3 a.m. on the other side of the town. I can ignore it. No, wait, you mean that's my mall? I'm in a panic. So we are always looking for those things. And again, we have a tendency to remember negative things more than positive things. And psychologists have done studies. If I set up an experiment so you win $20 and you get to keep it, a few weeks later you barely remember it. But if I set it up so you win $20, but then I rig the experiment so I take it back, you remember it or bugged about that for a long time. So we have different focus on what we're looking at. Now, whatever the reasons are for this increased media exposure, we also have the problem of seeing it constantly and trying to deal or process that information in ways that make sense to us. There's a long history of studying the news media and trying to look at what kinds of negative effects it has. Certainly can cause stress and anxiety, particularly when events are new, they're just happening, and there's all the breaking news coming on. There's also evidence that it can contribute to feelings of being depressed, feeling hopeless, and also apathy, or just starting to not care as much. Although I'm going to come back to that concept because I think that's interesting. Other things people will report about the media are that they get angry or they feel irritable after they see things. And sometimes that even affects their daily life, their ability to sleep and other things. So watching the news is not simply, a background. It really is affecting us. Although there's not a lot of clear evidence that it is causing something like post-traumatic stress in people who aren't already stressed. But it certainly might be exacerbating it in the cases of people who already have prior exposure. As we saw in the early video, and of course you're familiar at the school, children are very much exposed to negative experiences, both in their personal lives and through the media. Depending on whose study you look at, maybe as many as 60% of children living in inner city settings have personally witnessed or experienced violent acts. So those children in particular are probably at higher risk for that exacerbating effect of the media because they have seen violence personally and they're experiencing it now as well. Sort of as a sidelight, the same thing can happen to veterans who have PTSD from war experiences, and watching other kinds of war imagery on TV is upsetting to them. Now, it's hard to know how to help children when they're watching the news, partly because of the same problem you always have in education, which is that developmentally, people's responses vary. Younger children respond to the same information in different ways than older kids do. And so part of the trick is figuring that out. Now, what the research shows about small kids, under about 7, is that their fears are very much driven by visual information. Scary monsters, scary pictures. They, interestingly, don't do very well with unexpected things. So some of the movies and things that we will even push towards kids, like I saw a study where they looked at what disturbed kids in The Wizard of Oz, and young kids don't like the witch melting. That's an unexpected transformation. It's not something they're used to, and it makes them stressed. When younger kids experience stress through the media, they may not be able to put it into words the way other kids do, but often they'll show separation anxiety. They don't want to be away from the parent or the teacher. A lot of times they'll have sleep issues or behavior issues. They'll regress to doing things like sucking their thumb that they hadn't been doing for a while. Now, as kids get older, their views and their fears become more realistic. You can explain to them that the witch in The Wizard of Oz is a made-up story. But of course, part of the problem with the news is you can't talk it away. It isn't made up, and some of these things are problems that they're going to have to deal with and that we are trying to deal with now. And you will find older kids becoming more and more aware of abstract things like global warming, and sometimes understanding realistically, and sometimes being still not fully developed, they will be confused about how fast these things are happening or how commonly it's happening in their area, and so they can still have a lot of fear generated. The question is how to cope. And one of the things I do in my stress management classes is I always make people think back. So we're talking about stress and coping in the media and technology, and a little bit it feels like this is all new, right? But when I was growing up in the 60s in California, there was still this strong view that the Japanese might come and bomb the harbor in San Diego anytime. So even in the 60s, we were doing duck and cover drills. Some of you remember those? Of course, the desks would have tipped over and hit you on the head. It wasn't helpful. But when I was looking for images of that, I thought, you know, some things change, some things don't. And what we have to figure out is how to help kids. There are some good resources out there. The Department of Education there's just some small sort of printouts on how to help kids, but I sort of liked their model, so I decided to organize things on that. You know, of course you want to protect kids to the degree that you can, and that's really important. As educators, I'm sure you deal with parents who go to either extreme. They don't protect their kids enough, or they try to protect them too much. But the first key, of course, is to allow kids to know what those efforts are when you're trying to protect them. You can't necessarily raise them in a world where there's no violence or no disasters, but you can certainly be vocal to them about the steps you're taking to try to help them, and that includes planning for events and talking about it. Now, I like to give stories, and this is actually a story based on the tornadoes in Moore, Oklahoma a couple of years ago. One of the things I do is volunteer with the Red Cross and other organizations to do disaster mental health. So we will go into shelters where people have just had some major disaster in their community and serve as on-the-spot acute sort of psychological support. I will never, ever forget a 7-year-old boy that I met in the shelter. It was a high school gym, kind of like this in Moore, Oklahoma. He'd been in one of the 2 schools that was damaged in the tornado, rode out the tornado in the bathroom with his teacher and a lot of other kids. His dad had been unable to get from Oklahoma to the school, so he had to park and travel by foot 3 or 4 miles just to get to the school. They had lost their house. I mean, it couldn't have gotten much worse. So I'm sitting there talking to the dad in folding chairs. We're waiting for FEMA to get to them to tell them what they need to do to file. And the kid's next to me, and he starts poking me at my arm. And he said, "Did you know my school's gone?" And the dad's sitting beside me, and he raises his eyebrows and he whispers, "I can't get him to talk about it." And I said, "Okay, you go over to FEMA and I'll talk to him." I talked to this little boy for an hour and a half. He got down on the floor of the gym and he was using his finger to draw tornadoes for me. But you know how he knew they went in circles? Because he'd seen them on the weather. He had a perfect view of how tornadoes come on the weather. He told me about waiting in the school, and you know what made him feel good? My teacher held us all, and my dad ran all the way from Oklahoma City to get me. That was his take on the protection piece. But the other part that I found fascinating is he said to me, "I'm never going to lose anything in a tornado again." And I said, "Well, how are you going to do that?" He said, "I'm going to build a house with 7 walls. So if it blows down the outside wall, there's 6 more walls before it can blow down my house." I thought that was actually a very clever way for a 7-year-old to solve it. But what he was showing was exactly what I'm saying. The kids will find age-appropriate ways to cope. They'll think about it from their point of view. Of course I didn't say to him, "You can't build a tornado-proof wall." I said, "That's a great idea. You should talk to your dad about being an engineer, an architect. Maybe that's something you could really do." And then, of course, being a 7-year-old, he said, "And I'm going to be a weatherman too." And I said, "Okay, you can be both of those things. That would be fine." Part of the problem, of course, is that when you're talking to kids about traumas and disasters, it doesn't have to be that extreme. It may be just something you see on TV. It's hard to manage our own emotions too. And kids play off it. We all know that. If they fall down and you go, "Oh, no," then they cry. If you say, "Oh, you're fine, get up," they get up. And that might be simplifying it, but when you're talking about traumas and disasters, it's okay to talk to kids. So when you're watching footage of 911 and you say, "You know, this makes me really sad and upset, and I am also having trouble dealing with it," and I find that children actually like the fact that you're sharing. Now, you don't want to say to them, you know, "It's the end of the world and there's no hope," but letting them know that it's an upsetting event and they're part of it. This is another story which isn't quite as related, but I have twin daughters, and when they were little, I was terrified that one of them was going to get away from me in a parking lot because, you know, there's such trauma there. So I told them that I was scared of parking lots and they had to hold my hand so I wouldn't be scared. And that worked for several years. It took them a while to catch on. But they liked the idea that they were helping me. And I have seen kids be helpful to parents that way as well. So it's not like you have to be perfect as the parent or the teacher, but you do have to be somewhat honest. Now, I talk a lot in my stress management classes about social support. You might not really frame this. You know, everywhere you read it says you need connections, you need people around you. When we look at communities who are under stress, they do better if they rebuild in the same place than if people get scattered. But we all take this for granted. And the truth is that humans are the only species that has this developed language that we have. And we can use that to communicate and support each other in ways that other animals just don't do. In fact, people have looked at this, and animals will model behavior to their offspring, but they don't take their hand and show them how to do it the way we do. We need to take advantage of that by talking. Now, when you're talking about scary things, people often worry that if you bring it up, the child will be scared about something they weren't scared about before. But as the principal said, kids might not be talking about it to you, but that doesn't mean they're not thinking and writing about it. They often are. So how do you connect? How do you find out? The very first step is that you have to listen to what they know and ask them what they are thinking, and then use that information to move forward and teach them ways to cope. And Mike is really going to cover this a lot when we circle back to to the news media, because a lot of what we see in the media comes from particular points of views, particular sources. As I said, it gets repeated a lot. And so you have to actually learn how to analyze those things and how to decide what is accurate and real and what might be an exaggeration. You also have to help kids find solutions, look for ways to solve problems. That's a downside of media coverage right now. For those of you who are in education or just interested, I recommend a website called Solutions Journalism. It was started by a group of reporters, and they are advocating for news coverage that doesn't stop with telling you the horrible situation, but goes further and talks about what are people doing to try to solve this? What are options? How can we approach this? What can people do? This gets complicated with our news media, and if I had more time, I could go off on a whole riff about heroes. But one of the problems that happens with ubiquitous news media is that public figures never stay heroic, right? And people will say to me, well, when I was a kid, we had heroes. We believed in FDR and JFK. And I say, yeah, and if we had today's media and you knew about their personal lives, you wouldn't be able to make them a hero anymore. So what I work with kids is not the idea that there are people who are perfect and are heroes, but that there are regular people who do heroic things, and that can be something that they can do as well. So it's bringing it down to a more realistic piece, but it's also saying that there are people out there solving problems, not just telling us about the bad things that are happening. And it's also saying that some of the heroes are the people around you. They don't have to be in the media to be someone who's doing something great. Another thing I tell folks, and especially this works with kids, if you're worried about something you see in the media, often it is a large overarching problem. Global warming, animal welfare, other things. So try to find a way you can act locally on that topic. You probably can't fix the problem, but what can you do about it that'll make you feel better? I had a neighbor who had a dog that lived out in the backyard, and I don't know if any of you've had this, but it barked incessantly because it was lonely. There wasn't anything we could do about it. We tried calling animal control. So I started taking my daughters to volunteer at one of the local animal shelters. It made us feel better to help some dogs, even if we couldn't find a way to help that dog. And I think people need a sense of control. And even though you know you're not fixing the whole problem, it makes you feel less a part of the problem if you can do that. Another technique, it sounds so easy, but you've got to be mindful of what you're watching. Some people I talk to don't watch the news at all. Other people watch it constantly because that gives them a sense of control. Personally, I think a lot of it has to do with finding the form that you like. I don't like TV because by the time I have seen the awful picture, it's too late to turn it off. Now I've got that in my head. So I prefer to listen to radio coverage time. But there are lots of people who have different versions, and if you have kids in the house or even kids in the school, you have to be careful. Because like I said, the news is sliding into social media and ads and even TV shows where you might not have expected bad things to come. So just being careful and really talking about what you see. And in fact, the literature suggests that watching shows with kids and talking about what they're seeing is one of the best ways to help them cope, and it's probably better than telling them not to watch it at all. Because what happens if you forbid kids from doing something? Now they really want to do it. Raising twins had its ups and downs. One of my positive events was when the people at the after-school care told me that my daughters had told them they weren't going to watch a certain cartoon on TV because we'd watched it together, and I said, and we all agreed it wasn't a good show. You remember that dog-cat show? It was like some animal had two heads and it was always biting each other. I couldn't. But the point was I hadn't said don't watch it because all their friends were watching it. I'd watched it and said, that doesn't make sense. That's not very nice. How would you feel? And when you talk kids through shows, they will carry it beyond that time. Now I wanted to put in one more kind of plug for a book I think you all might find helpful if you're dealing with this media stress, but maybe if you're just dealing with stress in general. I wish I'd written it, I hadn't. It's called Rapid by Emery and Campbell, and there's about, I don't even know what edition it's on now, it is cycled out. It's about a type of psychology called cognitive behavioral psychology, which is based on the idea that you cannot control the world, but you can control how you think about it. You can control how you choose to react. This formula looks so stupid, but it is actually life-changing. The ACT formula has 3 parts. What they argue is that much of stress, whether it's about real life or the news, comes from not accepting reality. The way you know you're doing that is if you're saying, if only. If only I had left the house in time. If only my spouse would change. If only politicians would be different. If only I had made a different choice. And what they say is you have to get to the point where you say, this happened, accept reality. Given that, create a vision going forward. Since that happened, what are you going to do next? And then the take action is easy. Now I know I'm kind of preaching to the choir here again, but I have a small private practice in San Antonio. See lots of college age and other students. Have been working for about a year now with a young man who spent 6 years in a gang. He is now out of the gang, wants to go to college, is struggling with a lot, and the breakthrough in our therapy was when I said, stop saying if only I hadn't done that. You did it. It's part of your life, you can regret it, but it doesn't have to define your life. Let's find a way to create a vision and go forward from there. And that's something I think we should be teaching kids even about violence. All right, so there are all these school shootings and we wish they weren't happening. We can keep gnashing our teeth about it, or we can start thinking about what are the actual problems, what do we need to do, how can we do some of those things. So I recommend this book, and then that brings me around finally to my book on Mind the Gap, where I talk about a lot of this technology and media sort of stress, and really argue that once you start to figure out how things are causing gaps in your life, you aren't where you want to be, you don't have what you want, you don't have the career you want, the news, your community doesn't look like how you want, the change, the way to manage it is by thinking about it differently and then consciously making choices. And I would close by saying that having kids exposed to negative news isn't the worst thing that can happen. There's a lot of bad stuff that happens in life. So I see it as a way to teach them, how to manage, a way to help them learn to cope in more positive ways, and so that's how we can sort of frame this from an ed point of view. Now I'm going to hand this over to Mike, who's going to make my PowerPoints look like a kindergartner made them, but remember, that is his specialty.
So, good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, I should say. I first want to thank the Gesu School for having me here today and for putting together this colloquium on a topic that I have been working with for about the past 5 years or so. I would even say even longer, for about the past 10 years if you include some of the teaching that I have done. And have found that it's such a crucial skill for young people and adults also to understand, and that is that of news literacy. So I really want to thank you guys for having me here, and also thank all of you for being here today. So the topic that I deal with is news literacy. And what news literacy sort of boils down to is a course that works at teaching college-age students, where we started our course. We teach them and we give them a set of tools to use to know how to critically evaluate the news and information that comes across screens, TV screens, cell phone screens, or even information that they get from family, friends, that can then affect their daily lives. So first I'm going to give you a little bit of a background. So I am here from the Center for News Literacy, and what we did, starting back, we're part of the School of Journalism at Stony Brook University, which is a part of the State University system of New York. We have the only School of Journalism, and that is part of a state university in our state. And our dean, who is actually right here, back in 2008 started this class with the idea that With also teaching new journalists what path was being set for them, it was just as important to teach news consumers about the process of journalism, because these changes that not only the journalism students had to be aware of, the news consumer also needed to be aware of. Because we hear so many times today that the news itself, or the news business, is shrinking, is dying. People don't read newspapers anymore. People are not watching TV news as much anymore. But with that, there are changes that now we all have to be aware of and be ready with. So what we've done, our Dean, Howard Schneider, started this course on Stony Brook's campus in 2008. As of 2014, we have taught that course to over 10,000 students on our campus, because our university felt it was important enough to make this course a general ed course. So we're a very science and technology centered university, but we made it a course that any student could take that met general ed requirements. Then what we've also have done is we believe that it was even more important for us to spread the message and to then teach this to other teachers. So we do that primarily through our summer institutes. We do 2 summer institutes during each summer. We do one on Stony Brook's campus, which is on Long Island, right in between Manhattan and the Hamptons. So it's a real nice place to come if you want to come. And we also teach a summer institute in the city of Chicago. So what we do in our summer institutes is we teach our teachers our entire 14-week course in the course of about 12 days, 12 of the 14 days you spend with us. And then we spend the rest of that time helping you to develop lessons that you can then take back into your classroom. Because what we found was, while we thought we were great as college professors, we learned even more from our K through 12 educators. We learned that in one particular lesson that we teach on truth verification and the evaluation of sources, that we had a first grade teacher that told us, I found a way that I could teach this to first graders and second graders using the story of the 3 little pigs. What if the story of the 3 little pigs was told from the big bad wolf's point of view? How would the story change? What details would come out? And we thought, that's a great idea. We implemented it into our course. So that then lastly brings me over to what I primarily work on for the center, and that is our digital resource center. So 3 years ago, I joined Stony Brook as a full-time staff member. Before that, I came in actually as a teacher through their summer institute and was trained. And I came in to help them build an online repository of all the materials that we created to teach this course, and all the materials that were created with our teacher partners from all around the country. We have over 50 colleges and universities that are using our curriculum, and we also have partner programs that are happening overseas in countries such as Bhutan, Russia, Australia, Hong Kong, mainland China, and we're starting a new one in Israel. So we're trying to get as far out as we can. So what I'm here to do today is to talk to you a little bit about how we base our course, and also how do we think of the ideas of truth and verification. So the way that we start off our class is that we start by giving our students the context around the news. And we start off with a historical view of it by saying, we start with this guy on the left and we end with this guy on the right. Does anybody know who the guy on the left is? Is that left? Yeah, left. On my right. I should just say right here. This gentleman, anyone want to tell me? Take a guess. Gutenberg, Johannes Gutenberg. And then on this side is Zuckerberg. Okay? Mark Zuckerberg, the inventor of Facebook. So we start off by saying these 2 gentlemen invented technologies that completely revolutionized the way that we communicate with one another. Gutenberg, with his printing press, gave us a new way to collect and disseminate information and news. Before Gutenberg's printing press, to print an actual Bible, it took a monk 2 years to actually handwrite all of the material of one Bible. But afterwards, and after this invention, they were now able to create 50 Bibles in a year. So they upped it a bit, but over time we got even faster. Then we get to Zuckerberg, okay? And we bring in this idea of now we have tablets and smartphones, and now we have ways that we can communicate with each other from miles and miles away in a split second. And what that has done for us, and what we sort of frame this as, is now the idea of mass communication has been democratized. Because if I take this iPad and tweet out a message or send out a Facebook post, I have some of the same tools that your CBS affiliate or ABC affiliate or your NBC affiliate has to communicate with large groups of people. And there is a responsibility that comes with that. Because not only can we spread information, we can also spread misinformation. So, when you think about events, large events, such as 9/11, I can remember on that day I was sitting in a college classroom, and I had this, at that time, it was before everybody had a cell phone, I had my big data pager on. I thought I was real cool having text on my hip. So I pulled it out and saw that a plane had hit one of the Twin Towers. Now granted, this came from the AP, so there was still a gatekeeper of that information. I wasn't getting what we like to call raw information. I wasn't seeing the video that wasn't first vetted and thought about and thought to say, okay, we need to bring this information out by a news outlet. So there was a gatekeeper that thought about that, tried to verify that information before they took the step to then broadcast that. But then jump 10 years later, and you've got one of the biggest stories of the year in 2011, of SEAL Team 6 going in and killing Osama bin Laden, and this gentleman on Twitter breaking the story before the president could get on the air. So again, when you think about this democratization of media, we go back to that idea of that there is a responsibility that goes along with having the same sort of power. Now, so we say to our students that in this information age that we live in, it is now you that are in charge of determining what is reliable and what is not reliable. Because the traditional gatekeepers, not to say that they have gone away, those traditional gatekeepers are not always the only arbiters of the information that comes across to us that is purported to be news. So we start off by saying that news literacy is this. This is our definition of it. It is the ability to use critical thinking skills to judge the reliability and credibility of news reports, regardless of where they come from. And we say that this is important because reliable information is actionable information. It is information that can allow you to make a decision, take an action, and we recently added this, share it responsibly. Now that action can be as important as going to cast a vote. That action could be as small as, what do I want to have for lunch? Okay? So this kind of information, reliable information, is so critical and so important for us. And now we have lots of barriers sometimes to figuring out what is reliable information. First of those is, which Dr. McNaughton talked about, information overload. We are swimming in information. It is estimated, now this was from a study from 4 years ago, so now you can almost think of how much this has gone up, that the average American hears and sees over 100,000 words a day. And the average American adult sees and clicks on over 250 links while browsing the internet. So again, I said this was 4 years ago. Now could you imagine where we're at today? I like to tell the story that I use an app on my iPhone to check technology news, and it's just one subset of the news. I open it up, and there's 1,000 new articles. How in the world is somebody supposed to go through 1,000 articles a day? And then I tell the story of my younger sister who tells me, I don't watch the news. I'm done. I can't deal. So now, with our course, we ask our students, how do you keep them from becoming the type of person that just says, I can't deal, I'm not going to deal with this, I don't want to see it. I'm finished, I'm done. Because then you have a problem. You can't get through today's world without having some base of knowledge that comes from the news. Our second challenge that we talk about is the blurring of the lines between what we traditionally thought of as news, entertainment, advertising, promotion. And we teach one particular class, we tell our students there are information neighborhoods that you need to be aware of. We have great examples that come from like Jon Stewart, who took the news and entertainment and merged them together. And now for most, they would say, well, this is just an entertainment program. Jon Stewart himself said, I'm not a journalist, I'm a comedian. But after Walter Cronkite's death in 2009, Time Magazine did a poll, and it was found that this guy was the most trusted source of news in America. Now granted, yeah, it's just a poll, and we don't know all the details of who they asked, but think that on a comedy show that's parroting the news, he's thought of as a trusted source. Then we get around to a more nuanced type, and that is native advertising. Now some of you may have heard of this, and this is now the idea that news outlets sponsor content with advertisers, and instead of having a banner ad on the top or on the side, because they say people don't look at those anymore, now let's create content that looks like our traditional content, but at the top, we have a sponsor. So the New York Times has even dabbled into this, where they created an article that dealt with labor in women's prisons, which was actually a pretty good article, but it was sponsored by Netflix that was trying to sponsor their program, Orange is the New Black. Okay? So we have lots of different places and pieces where now we have to be more and more skeptical of the information we come across. And then our third challenge is this.
I'll answer the question. You want answers? I think I'm entitled. You want answers? I want the truth! You can't handle the truth!
And that's true. Because we say to our students, you have to overcome your own biases when you come across information. We live in a very polarized society. And we talk to our students about a concept called cognitive dissonance. And the theory is that if you encounter content or encounter information that does not fall in line with your already preconceived beliefs, you don't even hear it. You don't absorb it, you don't process it, it goes in one ear and out the other. So we say to students, and the line I like to use, I should say, I co-opted this, that you have to have the courage to listen to viewpoints that don't always line up with your own. Now that's not to say, okay, now you need to find every crazy blog out there and listen to everything they're saying. But it's to say, even when you find that one piece of content that validates your own point of view, you still have to step back and say, wait a minute, where is this information coming from? Who is saying this? And how are they verifying that information? And then I like to use this little comic that a person's desire to be well-informed is currently at odds with their desire to remain sane. Because it's not an easy thing to do. So, we say that in journalism, there is no black and white truth. The truth itself is provisional. And this is probably one of my big takeaways. Just like this guy. So for 75 years, and I remember inside of my own classrooms, I was taught that the planet Pluto, that Pluto was a planet. It was our ninth planet in the solar system. And then in 2009, scientists said, oh, we found new information and it's not really a planet. And people go, what? You said before that it was a planet. But scientists believe that truth is only found, they only try to actually, going back, they disprove things. Not that they are trying to prove things, because the truth can change over time. As more information is gathered, as more evidence is found, some things that we thought were truth, or big T truths, could be small T truths sometimes. We also say that the truth doesn't stand still. When breaking news is occurring, people are running around trying to find it, they're trying to rush and verify. But more details can come out that can then change our perception of what the truth is. Because for journalists, they say the news is the best version of truth that we have at the present moment. And there are too many occasions where sometimes we don't always hear that. We think, they told me this, that's it. Okay, I can walk away now, I know what's going on. No. You have to stay engaged, because breaking news is very chaotic. Because those that are actually trying to gather the news and those that are trying to get the news, if some big event happens, the police officers, the firefighters, whoever it is, they're dealing with the issue at that point in time. They don't have time to talk to the journalists. But they will find small bits of information, and in our now 24-hour news cycle, the journalists will say, we know X, but we gotta fill time. So let's try to talk about X, right? So it becomes very important for the news consumer to follow the story over time. I'm gonna give you a quick example of a recent story that came out that showed why this was so important. When we get into news, we think of three letters before I get to my example. It is V-I-A. We teach students that for news to be completely separated from all of the other information neighborhoods, it needs to be subject to a journalistic process of verification, for which there is an independent individual or organization that is directly accountable for that information that they pass along to you. And there are specific things that we look for when judging news. And for some of you may see that I left for you an outline of lots of our 14 lessons in our course. And we give you some of those other tools that we use to help students get to this point, to find V, I, and A. So now I can get to my example. So on the 1st of September, this story ran locally in Chicago.
Breaking news tonight at 10 o'clock. The search for 3 suspected cop killers. We're looking at Fox Lake, Illinois tonight. The city on lockdown. 3 men are on the loose, armed and dangerous, and they could be anywhere. Good evening, I'm Allison Rosati.
I'm Rob Stafford. Tonight, a massive manhunt for 3 cop killers, the biggest we have seen in many years in the Chicago area. Hundreds of local, state, and federal law enforcement officers are searching for the men who gunned down Fox Lake police officer Joe Glinowitz, a veteran officer just 1 month from retirement.
It's happening right...
Okay, I'm gonna stop that there. Could you guys hear that? Yeah. I don't know, maybe the speakers aren't pointing towards me, so I couldn't hear the word. Okay, so Lieutenant Lieutenant Glinowitz, on the 1st of September, called into his unit, said he was in pursuit of 3 suspects that were acting suspicious, quote unquote, and that he had been shot in the process of pursuing those 3 suspects. So, that's Glenowitz. Huge manhunt is started. The manhunt takes up 3 days, schools are closed, and it's on the news every single day for the next 3 days. Glenowitz is known in his own G.I. Joe. And the community really comes together and mourns the loss of Lieutenant Glenowitz. He ran a youth program for young people who are interested in careers in law enforcement. At his funeral, the governor shows up and says all flags should be flown at half-staff because of the death of Lieutenant Glenowitz. Now, as the story continues and the manhunt goes on, it's finally scaled back in about 3 days. They don't find the suspects. They don't have any credible leads. We hear a little bit about that, but more of it is about the death of this officer and the outpouring of emotion that's come from the people of this community. Then the Tribune runs a story about 10 days after the pursuit, saying that the coroner comes out saying that this officer was killed by one single gunshot. That's what we have found in the autopsy. And right after his report, he also mentions that this could have been a homicide, suicide, or an accident. He's not sure. And this is the coroner saying this. So you're saying this is a pretty good piece of information. But then other officials come out and say, wait a minute, the coroner wasn't allowed to give this kind of information out yet. But just the next day, we get word that actually the officer was struck by 2 bullets, not 1. We say, okay, so this is the next day. Then we learn that speculation starts to happen. What could have happened to this officer? Because the little kernel that was split out by the coroner that said, we don't know if this was a homicide or suicide, is still in people's minds. But we don't get a lot of extra information. And what tends to happen, and I can't say I know the psychological part of this, but when we have these gaps in our minds, we tend to fill them in with our own thoughts. So there's tons of theories that are thrown out about what may have happened to this gentleman. One of the writers for the Tribune says, while we wait and see what the evidence has to say, we should be members of a vigilant community, and we should not only think about how we consume news, but also how we should process that news. So again, going back to the idea of following the story over time. Then, just 2 days ago, this headline runs in the New York Times that this death stuns this little town because more information is found, and the leader of the task force that conducted the investigation into this officer's death found this.
The investigation found Glenowitz had been stealing and laundering money from the Fox Lake Police Explorer Post. This had been occurring over the past 7 years. Glenowitz was also found to have forged signatures and official documents. Our investigation has determined conclusively that Glenowitz intentionally left a staged trail of police equipment at the crime scene. Analysts determined the trail of equipment consisting of pepper spray, a baton, and his personal glasses was an attempt to mislead first responders and investigators to believe this was a homicide scene. The embarrassment comes to me personally that this is the first time as a law enforcement officer in my career that I felt ashamed by the acts of another police officer.
So, the truth that we understood at the beginning completely changed as new details came about. Now, this is not to say, first of all, this is a developing story. This is a developing situation. And this is not to say that the people of Fox Lake were duped. They were duped by this officer, but as the investigation continued and they found out what actually was happening. And this is also not to say that the journalists themselves were duped. Because now, Lieutenant Glenowitz now, and this was all over the papers yesterday, he's now gone from a hero to being vilified. So again, it pays for us to follow this story over time. So, and wrapping up, just a few things to take back. This is where verification, in which we put into our definition of news, can break down. In some cases, sources can be incorrect or outright lie to journalists. Journalists in our 24-hour news cycle sometimes rush to get the story first and sometimes do sloppy work. So we have to be vigilant as news consumers of engaging with multiple sources of news, not just one. Now, we don't try to point students to just say, oh, well, you just need to read the Washington Post and the New York Times and you'll be fine. It's to say that you should engage with multiple sources of news to do your own verification. And remember VIA. That you have to remember that when a piece of information comes across to you and purports to be news, that it follows those things. And lastly, we say, follow the story over time. Don't just come in, get the headline, and leave. Because more details in our idea of the truth and our believing or our idea of what is true can change as more details arrive. Thank you very much. I'm going to turn it over to you.
Good afternoon. It's a privilege to follow Mary and Michael, and I brought my iPad with me too. I just wanted you to see it. It looks a little different from Michael's. He's too fancy. So I think we've learned a ton from Michael and Mary today on cutting edge ways to begin talking to our children and helping our children manage in times of crisis and tragedy. And we're going to downshift a little bit from cutting edge to what I like to describe as progressive yet unconventional an approach to helping our children in times of crisis. Really, we're swinging in the opposite direction of where my colleagues started. And before we do this, I'd like to just say one thing. Mary and Michael and I, we talked, but we didn't really go through our presentations together, and you did a beautiful setup because they talked about the gap in knowledge and truth and stress. Michael just told us that there's an information revolution. And what I'm hoping to share with you today and suggest is not a revolution, but really is a very slow evolution in how we will help our children manage in the days that are upon us. So before I tell you what I have to say, I think you need to know a little bit about me, and I'll be very quick. I've been teaching for over 30 years, and teaching in the sciences for over 30 years, so there's my science image. And for all of you who know teachers or spend time with teachers, or for some of you in the room who know me, you know what that means is for 30 years I've been talking non-stop. And I think, and I don't speak for all teachers, but when's the last time you were with a group of teachers and no one had anything to say? Probably not much time passed in that room. And so when I think about talking and teaching like breathing. For teachers, talking is vital. We can't live without it, and we just can't help doing it. So for all these 30 years, I, like many of you, have been instructing and informing and advising young people of all age, delivering information, non-stop talking. And what I'm here to suggest is that the way we can best help our children is to stop talking. I'm going to suggest a method to you today that is radical, that is very rooted in the Quaker history of Philadelphia, that's so super difficult to describe and incredibly powerful. And because it's so difficult to describe, I've brought with me some friends, they're actual friends, but they're here virtually with me today from Germantown Friends School. And just as an image, this is the meeting house. It's called the Germantown Monthly Meeting on the campus of Germantown Friends School. So what I want to talk with you about today and suggest is this idea of sitting in communal, expectant silence. In Quaker schools, we call this meeting for worship. Tell me, when's the last time you got together with your coworkers and you said, you know what, let's just be quiet for 5 minutes? When's the last time you sat down with your family and you didn't talk, or the news wasn't on, or the radio wasn't on? When's the last time you got together with about 200 folks who you probably don't know and you sat in communal silence? I don't think we do that too often. But I'm here to suggest to you that this Quaker practice has a value in helping our children today manage with the stresses in their life and dealing with crisis and tragedy. And silence is critical to this process.
I've been going to GFS my whole life. This is like my 15th year. It's always just been very nice to have this like 45-minute block every single week where you're sort of just like, you're sitting in a room with the entire community. And I think that it does sort of build a sense that you're a part of something, you know, because you're just sitting in sort of expected silence, and then anyone around you will just like stand up and say something, and just whatever they want to share with the rest of the community. So I think that on the one hand, it does allow one to gain some sort of personal insight and just this sort of ability to listen to yourself and to others, but then the other side of it is that it's sort of building this sort of communal thing, even though most of it is spent in silence.
I should have said this at the beginning. The videos that you'll see were produced by a colleague of mine at Germantown Friends, and I literally sent her an email in the morning and said, I have this gig I need to do at Gesu from my friend Brian. And could you just go around campus and ask whoever you happen upon what meaning for worship means to them? So none of this is scripted. It has been cut and edited, but nothing was scripted. So silence, the first component of this evolution that I think we need to create on our campus, sitting in communal, expectant silence. Fundamental to this process of silence, and I don't know this gal, and I really didn't know anything about her until yesterday, but her name is Linda Miller. She's not my friend. I'm not proposing her book or suggesting you buy it, but I was reading the Journal of Independent School magazine yesterday, and it just so happened that she has an article in there on the spiritual child, and she has this, she suggests that deep within us that we're hardwired to have this spiritual life, to have this spiritual capacity, call it whatever you want. And it's like our capacity to read or to write or to do mathematics. You know, it's hardwired in you, and there's this developmental time frame in which you can best develop that capacity. So she says, you know, we're hardwired to have this spiritual capacity. It develops best in the first 2 decades of your life. And what it does is enables you to connect with that which is transcendent. It enables you to make connections. Well, what I have to say to Dr. Miller is that hundreds of years before functional magnetic resonance imaging and neuropsychologists and psychologists and geneticists and epidemiologists, the Quakers had this down. And they called this capacity for spirituality the inner truth or the inner guide.
It's about teaching the children to kind of go inward to their own inner self and to explore what that is and find that guide that's inside of them so that they can have some time where the teacher is not telling them what to do, the parents are not telling them what to do. They're looking for their inner guide.
I like that meeting for worship is very open to ideas and thoughts in your head and clear inside.
So you come to meeting for worship, you're sitting in expected silence. We have this fundamental idea that we have this inner capacity. We're hardwired to experience and develop this inner spirituality or inner light or inner guide. And what happens when you come to meeting for worship over and over again, when you practice it, just like you practice reading and writing and math and dance and music, you get better at doing it and you begin to form connections with your community, even though you're not talking to them. You suddenly, sitting in this space, recognize the interdependency and interconnectivity of you and the other people in the room, even though you're not saying anything. It's like being an organism. I can't help it, I'm a scientist. It's like being an organism, and every part, well, I'm an organism, every part of the organism is dependent on the other. My hand doesn't really do a good job without the rest of me. And when you sit in meeting for worship in this communal silence, you realize that you're part of some greater whole. There's this interdependence, interconnection. And I believe that our greatest source of protection in a world like the one we're living in right now, our children are growing up in, is our personal connection and that connectivity. So the sense of community that comes from sitting together silently is powerful.
It enhances our education in that you're learning things about yourself and your peers, and just, I don't know, I feel like you really do learn a lot, even if there's a meeting where no one ever speaks and you're just in silence. There's something really special about it.
It's a good place to kind of feel like you belong, because it's one of those things where it doesn't matter who you are, what background you come from, you just come together, you sit, and even though you're separated into age groups, you're all together, and you're all one whole, and one community, and one school.
And even if you don't stand up, if someone else says something, like, normally most of the time you can relate to whatever they say, and if you're like if you don't want to stand up, then you can still be a part of the process of sharing in that way. Yeah, it's a really safe space. It's like a warm place, inclusive. It's so hard to describe. It's like magical, even though that's so corny. It really is.
But how when you think back, you can just listen to others, that can give you motivation.
Try to help people understand what community means. And let people share ideas.
So you come together in expectant silence. What that means is that you come together honoring this capacity in every other person in the room. And as you do so, I believe, and I think our students point to this, is you become more deeply connected to the others. And I believe that what that does is it creates tremendous sympathy for humankind. I believe that it creates a real sense of responsibility for the other. And I believe it enables us to recognize that I have this relationship with the other and that I owe them. They deserve my support and my care and my encouragement. When you sit, so all humanity coming into accord, when you sit in expectant silence, you should be saying, Dana, what are you expecting? Well, you're expecting perhaps that someone may be moved to share a message. Someone may be moved to speak. So I think most of us in the room get what I mean when I say teenage angst. Does anyone here know an angsty teenager? Ever come across one in your right? So teenagers, right? They ask all the big why questions. There's a lot of energy in their lives about what's their place in the world. They have hormones that they're dealing with. They have relationships they're dealing with, stressors of life that they're dealing with. There's a lot of energy around it. Meeting for worship, sitting in communal expectant silence, is the perfect place and space for a teenager to find his or her own voice, to grapple with these questions, to speak their truths, to put them out into the airspace. And what's really neat about meeting for worship is there are no comebacks, there is no feedback. No one stands up and says, oh, but Dana, I don't agree with you. No, our work is to receive the messages with an open mind and open heart. Our work is to reflect on the message. Maybe I'll learn something from what they had to say. So our angsty, energetic teenagers have this opportunity to practice their ideas and their opinions, to put out their struggles and their concerns, and no one is going to say anything back to them. Oh, I want to go that way.
Worship also gives everyone a time to speak a message that comes to their heart, that comes to their mind, that comes to their spirit, and to share that with the entire community.
You really just stand up for what you really believe that's true.
Students will hear a message that really resonates with them, that is a counterbalance to the superficiality of their daily life in terms of TV and video games and just sort of lightweight stuff that they go through. They need a chance to acknowledge that there's heavier duty stuff going on in their lives, and they want to be able to think about it. And that's why I think meeting for worship is hugely valuable.
So I think meeting for worship, first of all, supplies that chance for contemplation and quiet that's often missing, and then sometimes the revelation of truth and the idea that someone's particular unique experience can speak to a larger human experience.
So 2 more facts about our outcomes of meeting for worship or sitting in communal expected silence. I believe that our world is pretty full of media. Didn't Michael and Mary just tell us that? And we have all these stressors. It's a 24/7 news and social media opportunity out there for our children and us. And meanwhile, I think, and I'm not speaking for everyone, but I think there's discord, mistrust in communities, locally and globally. That's the language out there right now, the language of opposition. And meeting for worship, sitting in communal expectant silence, gives you some time to step away from that and to reflect, I want to go back.
Is it causes people to stop and to be quiet and reflective in a world that doesn't take much time for that. I think the value of that is it allows people to adapt that to other parts of their lives even after they leave GFS.
Because it's a time to reflect, to kind of calm down, because you're always caught up in the work. So I think it's actually really nice. I definitely did not appreciate my first 2 years of high school just because I felt I could have been doing something more proactive. But I actually feel like because I had time to relax and think, I can get more work done actually because I kind of have a plan and I get to organize my thoughts.
And finally, I'd like to share with you that when you sit in communal expected silence, you get really good at listening. And not necessarily listening to others, you get good at that too, but you get good at listening to what's going on inside of you. You start to hear your struggles and your ideas and your perceptions, your biases, your stressors. You voice in a way that I don't think doing anything else allows you to do or hear. And then what emerges from this, even if you're hearing your own struggles and your own pains, sometimes your own joy and your own happiness, is that you leave with a new strength to address those issues in your life in ways that may not have been obvious to you before.
Upper school students use meeting for worship as a time both to reflect on what's happening in the world, on what's troubling them about what's happening in the world, and about what's troubling them about what's happening within themselves. I am so impressed at how teenagers can use this time, 40 minutes every week, to discern and reflect. I am certain that other schools have other ways of doing this, but it is foundational at Germantown Friends School. The meeting house contains both happiness when appropriate and sadness when appropriate, and it is our grounding.
You're not allowed to film in the meeting house, so this is actual footage of students just leaving meeting. And that is the interior. Meeting for worship or sitting in communal silence ends with a handshake, and that handshake acknowledges that commitment to the person next to you and to your community and the greater trust in the whole community. So, meeting for worship, sitting in communal silence. But if I were you, I'd be saying to me right now, great Dana, but what does this do? How does it translate? And this is this is an example of the power of meeting for worship. And this is why, and call it whatever you want, sitting in communal silence. This is why it's an evolution and not a revolution. It takes time. Last year, December, we saw footage of everything that was happening in the world. We opened our meeting house doors and our children sat in communal silence. And there were many messages delivered about the events in Ferguson. There was a lot of energy in the room. After meeting for worship, students gathered together and they decided they wanted to do something. They wanted to protest. By definition, protest. They wanted to disrupt normal, everyday activities to draw attention to something else. And on campuses across the United States and in Apple stores even, the protest method was a die-in. Our students decided to have a teach-in. This was their idea of a protest. They were disrupting the normal activities of a school, drawing attention to an issue by asking us no longer to be silent, but to talk about what was going on. We had two keynote speakers that faculty helped arrange, but these workshops were student-led and student-facilitated. What does it take for us to care? People of color in solidarity, white allyship. Unmade in America, figures of blackness in media, racism, heterosexism, gender oppression. You can read this. The students ran these workshops for other students. Teachers attended these workshops led by our students. This work emerged from weeks and years, months, of time in meeting for worship and communal expectant silence. The day ended with a vigil, silent community vigil. The next day, our children decided they were going to Washington. My work for this entire event was to organize the bus. The students went to the March on Washington. But so my suggestion is that while we have Mary's and Michael's message, as educators, as teachers, as leaders, we have to find other ways to give our students voice. We have to stop telling them what to do and what to think. We need them to find their inner capacity, and we need to give them the space to practice it, just like they're reading, they're writing, and their math. What's my time, Michael? I have a minute. Can we do something for 1 minute? Can we communal, expectant silence. So Brian is going to sit up here next to me. We're going to sit for 3 minutes. It's hard if you don't do it. Our students do this every week for sometimes 45, 55, 60 minutes. So we're just going to sit on the stage and we're just going to settle into silence. There's nothing to do. You may share a message. And you'll know it's over when Brian and I shake hands in friendship and respect and trust for this community.
Gesu School, who gives voice to young people. So our plan again is to chat with the speakers for about 10 minutes together, then we'll open it up to the audience. If you want to tweet us a question, you'll have an opportunity to go to the mic if you'd like to do that. But another way is to tweet us at the Gesu School or hashtag Gesu Symposium. So that's another way that you can get in touch with us. I'm going to start with Dana Weeks. So when we're in silence together and my truth doesn't equal up to the truth that I'm hearing, how do we resolve that? How do you suggest that kids deal with that?
Well, so let's start with the fact that I'm not Quaker. You may want to talk to someone who is if you don't like what I have to say. But there's no action of resolving. I mean, I think, and that's what we have to step away from. We live in a world where we're trying to constantly solve problems, fix situations, where in fact it's perfectly fine for you to think something that I don't agree with. Now, it may translate into the world into some other way that we're going to have to figure out to act and interact together, but I don't have to agree with you, and I don't even have to respectfully disagree with you. We each have our own truth. And if you come to it from this perspective of this capacity, that truthful inner capacity, then there's no reason for me to question your truth.
Michael, I feel like you touched on that a little bit with this idea of cognitive dissonance. Is that right?
Yeah.
Talk a little bit about that more.
So in the way that we teach it in our course, again, kind of rehash that cognitive dissonance is the theory that when you have your own kind of preconceived beliefs and notions that you have built up over time, and when you hear a piece of information that directly counters that, you have a tendency to not even process, not hear it, before you even react to it. It is that if it comes to you, it just slides right on. You know, it's just kind of...
Or you start talking to push it away?
Right. You can in some cases, but in others, especially with reading information, you may have a reaction to it, but it still is something that you do not take the time to actually absorb and then respond to.
Dr. MC, she said I could call her Dr. MC. I'm worried about the idea that children get irritable and closed off when they feel overwhelmed by media. What do we as parents and as adults do with that?
That's a good question. Yeah, I like to go by Dr. MC because my name is too long, and if anyone thinks about hyphenating, talk to me first. The students shorten that up for me. I don't think the fact that they feel angry or irritable is something to be worried about, but it's something to let them give voice to and to explore. And sometimes, both as parents and teachers, we kind of want to, like you said, fix it or gloss it over because it's making us uncomfortable. And that happens with depression and sadness as well. And a lot of times we're upset that a child is upset and we want to fix it, or we're afraid to even ask them because we think that's going to make them upset. And one of the things we know is that if someone is angry or depressed, asking them isn't going to make them more upset. Ignoring signs is going to make them more upset.
And when I'm upset or my husband's upset, is that something that I should share too, or is that something that I should protect my child from?
I think it is something to share. Kids are very aware. If anyone's lived in a family where people pretended not to be mad, how well does that go? No, when the people around you are mad. I don't think you tell them every fact necessarily. That's where the age appropriateness comes in. But I think it is good for them to hear that we struggle too, and that we can't always solve things. And that was part of what I was talking about with the heroes idea, because more in the entertainment media than anywhere else, they want perfect heroes who never make mistakes. And the reality is everyone does. And so modeling that and modeling dealing with it is a good thing.
You know, you talked a little bit about heroes are never perfect and they're all kind of falling and crumbling ahead of us. I gotta say, sometimes I think of that as a bonus. You know, there was a time when all of our heroes were doing things and there's a lot going on in secrecy. I think there's something to be gained in some ways from this 24-hour news, that we are probing and open and have some transparency. Can we talk some more about other things that we've gained from the amount of news that we have out there? Who wants to take that one?
Well, I can say that we live in a world where information is at our fingertips. Like, I like to look at the internet as a huge library, right? Because there's so many times, like I can just use one big example for myself, a personal example is that, so I have a YouTube account, I put a couple of videos up, whatever. But the video that has actually gotten the most views and has gotten the most response to is a video that, if any of you have one of those personal Keurig coffee makers, and you know, if you use it on a regular basis, it's got a tendency to clog sometimes. And it's not good if you're waking up in the morning, you need that cup of coffee, and it's just going and not doing anything. So I had figured out how to clean it out. And then one of the first places I look to when I want to find like tutorials and stuff on how to do things is like YouTube or somewhere on the internet, because I'm sure somebody else had the problem. So I had the problem, could not find anything, and then sort of tinkered with it and then figured out how to clean it out. So I was like, we make a video. So I made a video on how to clean it out, and like 30,000 people have seen the video. And like every other day I get a message that says, oh my God, thank you for putting this up. I couldn't figure this out. I had to throw the thing away. So I think there's a big strength in the fact, and I know this is away from the news, but I think in the fact that even when we do come across news, we can then go out and do our own vetting of the information. But one of the things that I came back to as I was walking on stage, I said, I hope I didn't just make it sound like journalists should not be trusted and that they all are sloppy. They're not, they're professionals. But also we as consumers of the news, we need to be more engaged, and we need to also ask for and demand that we get good news, not only from our journalists, we need to follow them, but also from those who give us more information and reports to me. We have the tools to be able to do it.
Go ahead.
I was also going to say that For people working in education, I had a student who wanted to do her honors thesis on this issue of heroes. So she asked high school and college kids. They didn't have media heroes, but they all had real life teachers, coaches, grandparents. So those people are out there. It's just not the way we used to define it as the presidential hero. But I'll throw out another idea sort of off topic, but there's an author named Stephen Johnson. He's had a television show recently, but he came to speak at UTSA, and one of his books is called Everything Bad is Good for You. But he really talks about the idea that we don't want to shut off media and news and technology because there are a lot of things it is helping us to do, including the way our brains shuffle information and deal with complicated problems. And the example he gives that I found very telling is he said, go back and watch an episode of I Love Lucy. 20-something minutes minus the ads, story starts, finishes, no complication, you just watch it. And then watch a television show today that has 10 episodes and goes back and forth in time, and you have to remember things, and he said, which one is a cognitive workout for kids? It's not as though TV is really asking them to do nothing, sometimes it's asking them to do a lot.
We're going to move on, or do you want to take that? Okay, I have a question for you, Dana. So, one of the tools that I use to kind of combat news that doesn't work for me, and there's a lot out there, my colleagues are great, and I'm great, I think, but we make mistakes, is I understand that I'm a broadcaster, but I think kids can be kind of trained in their roles as broadcasters, that they have a way to distribute information as well. Can you talk about some of the kids in your school that are broadcasters, have their own platform and their own audience?
Yes, I could do that. But can I answer a different question?
Yeah.
So here's the thing. I think there are many students at my school, at our school, who are able to do the Extraordinary Day for Extraordinary Times teaching. But I believe that there are students in every school who could do the same thing. And it's that. But to me, it goes back to the idea of teachers not talking at the students and allowing the students to tell us the way they want to go. I always think of teaching as, I imagine that I'm standing next to the students and then sometimes behind them, but I'm rarely in front of them. They're leading me, I'm sometimes pushing them, and sometimes we're just side by side walking along this journey. And I really believe that all of our kids have this power to broadcast, to share a story, to lead us, and that we just have to let them do it a little bit. I think, standardized tests and norms, and we've been spending 24 hours talking about education, get in the way of our children being able to be their best broadcasters. And I think we need to step out of it, we, the big collective education we, and let our kids start leading.
And when you were saying that a lot of the local news can be the most violent news, I know, especially if we are here to talk about inner city kids, they see their neighborhoods reflected on the news. And if they know that they're a broadcaster too, they can say, I have a different story to tell about Black boys. I have a different story to tell about this neighborhood. And it's just as powerful. It may not be on ABC News or WHYY, but I have an audience and a voice to share it as well.
Can I say something to that? Commissioner Ramsey, the police commissioner in Philadelphia, we had the privilege of having him speak on campus on Tuesday or Wednesday this week. And he grew up in Chicago. I don't know exactly where in Chicago. And he described his neighborhood, and he said, it was a variable neighborhood. And he would see these stories of his neighborhood on the TV, but it wasn't his experience of the neighborhood. And so that he would go to school and say, well, that's not what I experienced. Bobby and I played pool in my basement all last night, or whatever it is that we did. And I think it's really important. It goes back to that point of our children being their own broadcasters.
And that goes back to the point I was making about control. We don't like ambiguity and lack of control. How many of you have said before, it's not getting bad news that drives me nuts, it's waiting to hear if it's bad or not? Even if the test is negative, at least then I have something I can work from. And I really liked what Dana said about letting the students find solutions. And I was thinking about it, I'm working with college kids, but really at UTSA we are a really large state school, majority Hispanic. Hispanic students. So it's really a lot of the same issues, just at another level. But the big thing in the news right now is that the Texas state legislature just approved concealed guns on campus starting in August. And this is causing chaos. Students, faculty, and staff are against it, but they voted for it. So the faculty is gnashing their teeth, and everyone's trying to figure out where we can limit the guns. And there's a group of students who have started a chapter of a national organization called Active Minds. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but Active Minds is completely focused on decreasing the stigma around mental illness. So while we're all arguing about where the guns are going to be, they're talking about helping people with mental illness, depression, anger, and anxiety cope so we don't get to the point where they're bringing a gun on campus. And I thought that was a very good example of solving the real problem at a grassroots way.
Great. All right, so this is your opportunity. President Brian Carter is going to come to you if you have a question. Who wants to be first? Over here?
Yes, good afternoon.
Give us a second to get to a microphone to you.
I might not need one.
You look like a man who speaks his mind.
W. Curtis Thomas, State Representative, and under redistricting, this is now part of my district, but I'm familiar with this community. I grew up here, and so I've spent some time here and at other broker schools. And as I look at this whole question of transforming inner city education, I think part of the struggle needs to be connecting the school with the surrounding community. How many kids here, Gesu, know that the first female state Supreme Court justice lived a few blocks from here? Or that the third highest member of the AME Church, African American, handled a church just a few blocks from here, and his daughter was the first African American woman to moderate a vice presidential debate. Because so often in the inner city, you grow up thinking that everything is hopeless, that it's all bad, and that and you kind of start expecting guns and expecting some of the other things that just kind of destroys you. And so, in your experiences, how do you feel about developing curriculum that connects communities with not those heroes, but people who look, talk, and walk like them and doing extremely well?
I guess I'll start on that. You clearly read my super secret notes that are in my other red folder. The fact is that that's the only way to do it, I believe, is to begin to create these, at least in inner city schools, and that's the question you were asking, or the area you're pointing to. I mean, we have to, as educators, start thinking about how we use the outside of our school building to teach our children. In a city like Philadelphia, you don't have to go very far to get an education, to learn some history. There's no rule that says you have to learn to read by sitting in a particular chair in a particular room with a particular book. You can also learn to do that down on the Schuylkill River or the Art Museum steps or the steps down the street and learn a little bit of history at the same time. So I don't even think it needs to be a fully formed curriculum. I think it could be a single teacher and his or her class, leaving the classroom if we're allowed to do that, exploring the neighborhood, sitting on steps, asking questions about it. You could do a great science experiment around here just by bring a little vinegar with you and figure out what kind of stones they are. So we think of schools in a very traditional way in our country and in this city. And I think we have to start thinking outside of the box and literally outside of our schools and, to your point, to our community. And then that's where our children will learn those stories that you just shared with us.
Yeah, one of the things that students came from so many places all around the city that there wasn't that much of a sense of community there in the school, because all the students knew was, I gotta get on this bus, I gotta get on this train, I gotta figure out how I'm gonna get home tonight, so on and so forth. So they weren't as invested in the school as community. But what we started to talk to them about, especially in creating media, it gave them an opportunity to get outside and get into the community and learn more about the people who were around them, even the people who were just sitting next to them. I mean, I was always flabbergasted at the amount of diversity we had in our school. My school, we had a lot of students who came from West Africa. We had a number of students who came from the Caribbean, San Salvador, El Salvador, parts of South America. And they all had their own little cliques, and they stuck in their clique. And we used media to tell students, like, why don't you open up a dialogue with these students? I'm in Chicago, which is where I am, which I know is completely like, didn't you say you was in New York and Stony Brook or whatnot? But yeah, so I do work for Stony Brook, but I live in Chicago. And in Chicago, it's very much a city that's in the same sort of situation. You hear about these stories about this kid was shot. I mean, just yesterday the story was, well, there have been developments about a 9-year-old who had been killed and was basically executed because his father was in a gang. And it was a retaliation killing. And it again happened down in the Inglewood area, Auburn Gresham neighborhoods on the south side, where again, all you hear is this shot, that gun, this box, that, this, and that. And kids come into programs, and I've worked with a couple of programs in the city which focus on youth media. And a lot of times the kids come in and they start to talk about story ideas, and they brainstorm, and the kids say, oh, well, about the violence. And sometimes we say to them, how about we look at another part of this neighborhood? They live in these neighborhoods, and what they hear from the media is violence, guns, and all that. And we start to say to them, we're not trying to downplay it that's happening, but there's a lot more that's happening in your neighborhood that we do not hear about. I had students this summer who went out and talked to like a frozen yogurt shop that had been in the neighborhood for like 5 years, 2 doors down from the school, and nobody even realized. They didn't, I mean, they walked past it almost every day and didn't know what it was. So it gives them that opportunity to sort of find out about these things. And I think it also goes back to an idea, a bigger idea, where sometimes we as the audience can also engage with our own local media outlets and sometimes say, I know you did this story, I appreciate hearing about this, but there's also this that's going on. Can I talk to you about that?
Yeah, Dr. I was going to say there's a psychology concept called the optimistic bias. And you know, when you get in your car, you don't think I'm going to get in a wreck because that's statistically the numbers. You say, I'm a good driver, I have a good car, I'm fine. And people do that about their communities too. And even surveys of really poor inner city communities say that the people who live there give it a better viewpoint than people who only know about it from the media. And that is in part because the reality, the nice teacher, the good person in the library or the yogurt store doesn't make the media. And so we need to play to that a lot more, however we can.
Do we have another question? I'm going to send the microphone to, the representative wants to speak again, but I'm going to have a question before you go. Dr. MC, I just don't want to breeze over a child was executed in Chicago. If I'm in 3rd grade and I hear that, am I able to distinguish that that's in Chicago and that's far away? Or do I think that could happen to me?
That is a huge problem with kids because the reality and the explanations and the rationale may not stick to kids who are 6, 7, even younger than that. And so a lot of times we try to give them, oh, that's that many miles away, and they don't hear it. And they do need more specific reassurance about where they are and how safe they are in a place. But that doesn't mean that we need to keep them from knowing about it, because if you're a parent, you know you can't. You can say you're not watching TV at my house, but then they get all kinds of distorted stories somewhere else. So you have to be willing to talk to them about what happened. And again, this is where I say coming back to ideas of what can they do? That's what your kids did. They came out of it saying, this is horrible. And it happened in another whole city, but what could we do? You want to share the microphone? Go ahead.
I think also role play, helping young people kind of walk through the experiences that impact them. For example, I'm waiting for one of my schools to say that I'm going to create a Pennsylvania General Assembly. I'm going to teach the legislative branch of government through role play and get them involved in raising questions about a process that impacts them day to day. We are always impressed when schools bring young people who talks about what happens at the school and how they would like to take advantage of it. I think we can also deal with this whole thing of trauma, helping young people talk about some of the experiences. It's ironic that you raised the question. That would happen more often than not in urban America, but in suburban and rural America, you see mass shootings. So we have a real problem of violence that we have to deal with, and I think catching these young people at an early age. I think having a STEM program in pre-K can kind of help us begin to shape minds in a way that young people can maximize their chances of reaching greatness.
Thank you. We have a question here.
Hi, my name is Sharita Rooney. I am a graduate student at Westchester University. Right now I'm doing some research on the school-to-prison pipeline and the funneling of our Black boys into the prison industrial complex. My question is, as I was sitting listening to the conversations about cognitive dissonance and things of that sort, I think about how our young Black boys kind of are creating an image of themselves through the media, and their educators are also. So the Quaker tradition actually was very encouraging for me, just to see that space is being given to those students, but unfortunately it isn't being given to a much larger group of students who can't afford to go to Friends. So my question is, what does this look like in public schools, in our schools that are affecting, excuse me if I'm getting emotional, that are affecting students like the ones we see walking down the street outside of this school?
Is the space for expected silence transferable?
Yes. Thank you. I grappled today with whether or not, after when Brian and Julianne asked me to do this in a protocol, I really grappled with what I was going to share. And I can probably point to, some checklists of what you could do with students. But I really believe that every teacher can translate what I described and learn more about it in each of their classrooms and create that kind of connection through silence in their classrooms. It takes 2 minutes a day, 3 minutes a day. We start many of our meetings, I start my personal meetings with silence. Sometimes we stop in the middle of a meeting because there's too much energy, and we come to silence. And I think if you start practicing, teachers start practicing this. There's jargon today, mindfulness. I mean, this is not mindfulness because it's a little more, it's active in a way. I don't really even know what mindfulness is. I should be quiet on that. But I think it's something that we can do, and I think every teacher can do it. Every human being can do it. We all have that capacity, and I don't think it's outside. It's not only for students who can afford to go to certain schools. I believe it's for students who go to any school. But I also believe, and I'd like to step back a little bit and say that I think the fundamental issues we have to give our teachers the right and the freedom to do that in their classrooms and not codify so strictly what we're asking them to do every moment of the 5 times and write it, I will not cheat, or whatever we tell them to do, is going to make them better students. But I believe that if we allow our teachers to do what feels right in that moment, to give them that liberty in the classroom, and then to give them a variety of tools to use, that all of our children will have access to that education.
I also wanted to say that this is kind of my soapbox, and I'm going off a little, but one of the issues I have is how little most people in the world know about the conditions in public schools and what teachers actually are dealing with and what kids are dealing with. Come from a family of public school teachers where we talk about kids who are turned down a college interview because they don't have anything but sweatpants to wear to the interview. Teachers who keep food in the cupboard in their classroom. You might think that's not happening at the college level, but I have had homeless students at UTSA living in their car, trying to finish a semester. And I think those of you who are sort of in the trenches know that, but there's this tendency to look at it from outside and say, well, there's all these horrible kids running loose in the streets causing violence. And if we could find a way to use the media to personalize those stories and to make people much more aware of what a struggle some of these kids have to get to school, never mind get through school, it would help.
And I said I grew up Bradley. I learned how to read and write Russian right at 24 for that in a public school. I learned how to dress for success at a public school at 21st and on. While there were a number of people who would die every day, I learned Russian from hiding down on the 7th floor at home. My point is, all schools can be free. All kids can achieve. If we do not beat up on one to make the other look better. Let's put our children first, and then whether it's parochial, public, and what have you, all work together to allow all kids to reach their greatness.
I'm going to echo that because we all know that every neighborhood, every school has resources, whether that's financial resources or connectedness or a long history of being here and knowing each other. We all know that every community has resources. We have about 3 more minutes. If you would like to ask a question, we're going to send the microphone to you, but I'm going to ask for some closing thoughts from our speakers. I'd like to end with the idea that news media doesn't just wash over us. We have choice, actually. There's a spigot that we can turn on and off. Can each of you just give me a little bit on that, and we'll close out with that. Michael?
Well, I guess from our perspective on the news literacy side, what we try to say to students is stay engaged with the news. Although, because our students they come in very cynical and believe this ain't got nothing to do with me, I don't watch, whatever. But our first assignment that we give to the students is a 48-hour news bucket. We tell them, you have to disengage with the news. And what it shows to them is that it is they find it as much harder than they think, because they find that news is all around them. We almost get news through osmosis. So what we say is to continue to engage, and continue to engage with find the good sources of news. Find the good sources of news. And then when you get the big headline, and the one line I wanted to bring to was slow down. Before you are ready to make a decision or take some action or take a side, slow down. First think to yourself, where did this come from? Who told me this? What do I know? What do I not know? And how do I know what I know? I think if we can take that step, then that allows us to kind of, not reverse the spigot or turn the spigot down, but know how to filter.
Talk to me about talking to kids about choice.
Talking to kids about what?
Choice. The choice that they have and what they consume.
Really spend a lot of time talking about how the brain works, how we remember things, what is cognitive dissonance, how can you choose your responses. And I argue that nobody can ever make you think anything. You choose. And so kids will say, well, you have to be depressed if you see that. And I say, no, you don't. You could choose to be depressed at seeing that, but you could pick another choice, another way to respond, and that's how you bridge those gaps.
Dana, finish it off for us.
I'll finish it off. Michael and Mary has said, that our work as teachers and parents and educators is to give our children, no matter where they are, no matter what school they're in, that space to sit quietly, to teach them the value of that space, to help them make those connections, because we know those connections will save their lives. And then we need to be quiet and let them take the lead.
Michael, Dr. MC, Dana, Tanya, thank you so much. And what I heard is we want our children to be curious learners and to be critical thinkers. But it sounds like what you were talking about, Dana, is something that's in the Jesuit tradition of the daily examine, which is discerning and reflecting. So those are things that we can definitely do. And as you said, you can do them in any school with a small amount of time. In terms of broadcasters, we have broadcasters here. And so we'd be, when we have our broadcasters who are interested in a particular topic, we'll come to WHYY so that they can be heard there as well. But I think it's critical what you talked about, Dana, is that intentionally practicing silence, the daily examine, and listening, encouraging our children to talk about it. Because like I said, they're not talking to us, but they're writing about it. So we want them to express their thoughts so that we can work with them through the daily examine to get them to where they feel comfortable about what they're seeing on the news, what they may see in their own communities. So thank you very much. I do appreciate it. And please. The symposium is not possible without the generous support of so many of our friends, and I just want to recognize them before we close. And our presenting sponsors, Daryl Shore and Mark and Paula Solomon, the Arrett family in honor of Miss Vivian Arrett and Janny as well, but also our sponsors, James and Diane Brecker, Morgan Lewis, Susan and Richard Tressiter, Craig White, and then as well, CVS Health, Glen Mead, Locust Capital Management, Philadelphia School Partnership, Shipley School, St. Joseph's Prep, Wells Fargo, and lastly, Richard and Mary Cornelius. So thank you once again, and we'll now have a reception where we can continue discussion in the sidebar about what we heard today. Thank you so much for joining us.